That boy stole from my father. Everything!
I didn't steal anything. I gave him the one thing you never did.
One night, one test, one act of kindness that should have meant nothing. But when a dying billionaire leaves his entire fortune to a cleaning woman's son instead of his own children, the world demands to know why. What happened in that library 10 years ago that was worth $30 billion? Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of the boy who changed a dying man's heart and the legacy that rewrote an entire family's fate. The storm arrived with the mourners, both unwelcome and inevitable. Rain hammered against the tall windows of Edwin, Mallory's seaside mansion in relentless sheets, each strike of lightning, illuminating the jagged cliffs beyond in harsh, skeletal white. Inside the oak-paneled drawing room, 24 figures dressed in black shifted uncomfortably on antique chairs that creaked with age, their hushed whispers barely audible beneath the wind's savage howl. The air hung thick with wet wool and expensive perfume, mingling with the faint staleness of a house that had already begun forgetting its master. Shadows stretched long across Persian rugs as thunder rolled across the bay, rattling the crystal chandelier overhead. No one looked at Edwin's empty armchair by the fireplace, its leather worn smooth by decades of use. They looked instead at one another, with sidelong glances, calculating, measuring, wondering who would walk away wealthiest. Fingers drummed on armrests. The room pulsed with barely contained greed dressed in mourning clothes. Clara Ung stood at the mahogany desk near the window, her hands resting on a thick legal folder bound with red ribbon. She was a woman in her late 50s, her silver-streaked hair pulled tight in a bun that matched the severity of her tailored black suit. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her dark eyes swept across the assembled crowd with cool assessment. Her fingers betrayed the slightest tremor as she untied the ribbon and opened the folder with deliberate slowness. Each movement weighted with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. The room fell silent so abruptly that the absence of sound felt like physical pressure. Even the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath. Clara cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension, like a blade through silk. "Edwin Mallory's last will and testament," she began, her tone, measured and professional, "leaves the majority of his estate to someone unexpected." The words detonated like a grenade in the hushed room. Chairs scraped backward with harsh screeches. Daniel Mallory shot to his feet so violently that his chair teetered before crashing back down, his face flushing crimson beneath his carefully styled hair, the vein at his temple pulsing visibly. His sister Victoria clutched the armrest of her chair with both hands, knuckles white as bone, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Their younger brother Marcus stood frozen, one hand halfway to his chest, as though checking for a wound, his breathing shallow. The protests erupted in overlapping waves, voices rising in pitch and fury. "This is absurd!" Daniel spat, his jaw clenched so tight the words barely escaped. "Father would never—" "Who the hell is standing in the back?" Victoria interrupted, whipping around with such force that her diamond earrings swung wildly, catching the lamplight. All eyes turned as one, a synchronized movement of shock and suspicion. The stranger stood in the shadows near the doorway, partially obscured by the heavy velvet curtains. He had not taken a seat among the mourners. He had not spoken a word. He simply waited in silence, as though he had always been there, invisible until this moment. Marcus took a step forward, squinting through the dim light, with confusion and dawning outrage, his breath quickening. "Someone answer me," Victoria hissed, her voice cracking under the weight of her indignation. Oliver Mendes kept his eyes lowered, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards beneath his feet. He was 18 now, tall and lean, his shoulders slightly hunched as though trying to make himself smaller, less visible. His dark hair fell across his forehead in damp strands from the rain. He had walked through to reach the mansion. In his right palm, he clutched an antique pocket watch, its silver case warm from being held so tightly, the chain coiled around his fingers like a lifeline. His thumb traced the engraved initials on the case over and over, the motion automatic and soothing. He did not look at the siblings glaring at him. He did not acknowledge their fury. He barely seemed to breathe. The watch ticked softly in his hand, the only sound he could hear above his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Clara lifted a single sheet of paper from the folder with both hands, the document crisp with Edwin's distinctive signature at the bottom, her movements slow and deliberate. The name hovered on her lips, ready to shatter the room's fragile order. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, so bright it bleached the room white. Casting Clara's face in stark relief, she opened her mouth to speak. The scene dissolved without warning. The mansion vanished. The mourners, the storm, the fury, and the watch, all of it pulled backward, like a wave retreating from the shore. The room filled with white light, and suddenly it was 10 years earlier. A cramped basement apartment flickered into view, its walls stained with water damage. A young boy sat at a battered kitchen table, carefully taping the sole of a woman's worn work shoe with strips of duct tape, his small hands working with precision. The past rose up to swallow the present, pulling the viewer down into the mystery of how a stranger with nothing came to inherit everything. The screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of rain and the distant echo of a pocket watch ticking in the dark. Edwin Mallory sat alone at the head of his dining table, the mahogany surface stretching empty before him. A single place setting occupied the expanse, the china gleaming coldly under the chandelier's light. He lifted his fork, spearing a piece of roasted chicken that had gone cold, chewing without tasting. The silence pressed against his eardrums, broken only by the scrape of silverware and the distant crash of waves. His mind replayed the afternoon's confrontation. Daniel's voice echoed through his thoughts, demanding access to trust funds meant to remain locked for another decade. Victoria had stood beside her brother, suggesting Edwin might reconsider the distribution given his advancing age. Marcus had said nothing, but his silence carried its own accusation. Edwin set down his fork, the clink unnaturally loud. His children had not come to visit. They had come to measure him for a coffin. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping harshly. In the hallway, he retrieved a leather-bound clipboard, its pages filled with cramped handwriting documenting every household object. His fingers traced down the inventory list. A silver letter opener from the study missing. A crystal decanter from the bar vanished. Even the jade figurine his late wife had treasured gone. Edwin's mouth twisted into a bitter smile as he made notations, his pen pressing hard. "Everyone steals if given the chance," he muttered, his voice a low rasp in the empty corridor. "My own children. No different from common thieves. Daniel thinks I don't notice when he pockets the silver. Victoria pretends to admire something, then it disappears into her purse. And Marcus, silent Marcus, he watches and waits like a vulture. Blood means nothing when money is on the table. Nothing at all. The words hung in the air, a verdict pronounced on his own flesh and blood. He set the clipboard down with a thud that echoed through the mansion. Across the city, in a basement apartment where ceiling pipes dripped and walls held perpetual chill, Lara Mendez sat at a second-hand table sorting bills with trembling hands. Overdue rent notices formed a threatening stack. The electric company's final warning sat beside the landlord's eviction threat. She flipped through them, calculating numbers that never added up. Her eyes burned with exhaustion from double shifts at 3 cleaning jobs. Oliver sat cross-legged nearby, holding one of his mother's work shoes. The sole had separated from the leather, exposing cardboard she had been walking on for weeks. He worked with duct tape, cutting strips and pressing them firmly along the gap. At 8 years old, he understood poverty better than most adults. He glanced at his mother's hunched shoulders and returned his attention to the shoe. The television flickered in the corner, broadcasting evening news. A meteorologist gestured at a weather map showing a massive storm system. Schools across the county would be closed tomorrow. Lara barely registered the words until her phone rang. She snatched it up, recognizing the cleaning agency number. "Yes, this is Lara," she said, straightening despite the exhaustion weighing her down. "The Mallory estate? Tonight?" Her eyes darted to the window where snow had already begun falling. I understand. The regular girl called in sick. How many hours are we talking about? She listened, her fingers tightening around the phone. 12 hours? That's a full overnight shift. Her voice carried a mixture of desperation and hope. Yes, I know the rate is higher for emergency calls. Triple the usual? That would be enough to cover. She trailed off, unwilling to speak her poverty aloud even to a stranger on the phone. I can be there in an hour. I'll take the bus to Cliffside Road. Thank you. Thank you so much. Her eyes widened slightly as she ended the call. Extra hours meant extra money. Enough, perhaps, to push back the landlord. But the location made her pause. The Mallory Mansion. The name carried weight among cleaning staff. Whispered stories of a difficult old man who tested employees in strange ways. She ended the call and looked at Oliver, still working on her shoe. Schools were closed. She had no one to watch him. The storm was already beginning, fat snowflakes visible through the window. Taking him to a client's home violated every agency rule, but leaving him alone for 12 hours wasn't an option. "Oliver?" she said quietly, the name heavy with reluctant decision. He looked up, his dark eyes searching her face. "You're coming with me tonight. To work." She watched his expression, waiting for protest that never came. "I know it's not ideal, baby. I know you shouldn't have to sit in some stranger's house while I clean, but the storm is too dangerous for you to be here alone, and this job pays triple. Do you understand what that means? It means we can keep the apartment," Oliver said softly, setting down the repaired shoe with careful hands. "Smart boy." Her voice cracked slightly. "Get your coat and your book. You'll need to be very quiet. Invisible, really. Can you do that for me?" "I can do that, Mom." He stood and moved toward the tiny closet where their winter clothes hung. "I'm good at being invisible." The word struck her harder than any blow, revealing how much her 8-year-old son had already learned about surviving. She turned away, blinking against the burning in her eyes, and began gathering her cleaning supplies. The rain arrived in violent sheets, battering the windows of Cliffside House with such force that the glass rattled. Lara stood at the entrance, her hand gripping Oliver's shoulder as they stared up at the mansion looming before them. The structure rose 3 stories into the storm-darkened sky, its stone facade slick with rain, ivy clinging to the walls. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating gargoyles along the roofline, their mouths open in silent screams. The door swung inward before Lara could knock, revealing a hallway lit by flickering sconces. She stepped forward, pulling Oliver with her, their wet shoes squeaking against marble floors. The air inside tasted of old wood and furniture polish. Oliver pressed closer to his mother. This was not a home. This was a mausoleum. A woman emerged from the shadows so suddenly that Lara gasped. The housekeeper was thin and severe, dressed entirely in black with her gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes swept over Lara with cold assessment before dropping to Oliver with visible disapproval. "You're the emergency replacement," the housekeeper said, her voice clipped and formal. "I wasn't told you'd be bringing a child. The schools are closed because of the storm," Lara explained quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I had no one to watch him. He'll be quiet, I promise. You won't even know he's here." The housekeeper's expression suggested she doubted that very much, but she turned without further comment and began walking down the hallway with brisk steps that echoed against the high ceilings. Lara followed, half dragging Oliver, whose wide eyes darted from portrait to portrait. Dead men in suits stared down at them with judgmental expressions. "Mr. Mallory is very particular about his routine," the housekeeper continued without looking back, her voice carrying through the corridor with practiced ease. "He rests in the library every evening from 9 until midnight. Under no circumstances are you to disturb him during this time. Is that understood?" "Yes, of course," Lara said, nodding vigorously even though the woman couldn't see her. "He is an elderly man who values his peace and quiet above all else." The housekeeper stopped before a heavy oak door, her hand resting on the brass knob. "If you wake him, even accidentally, You will be dismissed immediately without pay. The agency will be notified of your incompetence. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear, Lara whispered, her throat tight with the weight of the threat. The housekeeper opened the door and gestured inside before disappearing back down the hallway, her footsteps fading. Lara stood at the threshold, looking into the library with growing dread. It was a cavernous space lined with books whose leather spines gleamed dully in the firelight. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling as they consumed logs. And there, in a leather armchair before the fire, sat Edwin Mallory. Even from the doorway, Lara could see that he was a man of considerable presence despite his age. His white hair caught the firelight, creating a halo effect. His hands rested on the armrests with deliberate placement. On the small table beside him sat a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, untouched, and beside it, an envelope. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, positioned at the very edge of the table. Even in the flickering light, Lara could see the word donations written across the front in elegant script. Her pulse quickened. Money. Right there. Within reach. Edwin's eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. Lara couldn't shake the feeling that the scene felt staged, arranged too perfectly. She pulled Oliver into the room, closing the door behind them with a soft click that seemed deafening in the heavy silence. The fireplace crackled. The rain drummed against the windows. She knelt beside Oliver, gripping his shoulders, her fingers digging into his thin jacket. "Listen to me very carefully," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "You are going to sit in that corner." She pointed to a spot near the door, far from the sleeping man and the dancing shadows. "You will not move. You will not speak. You will not touch anything. Do you understand me, Oliver? If you wake that man, we lose everything. Everything. The rent, the electricity, the food. All of it. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Oliver nodded, his dark eyes enormous in his pale face, reflecting the firelight like twin mirrors. "If you wake him up, there will be consequences," Lara continued, hating herself for the fear she was instilling in her child, but unable to stop the words from pouring out. "Serious consequences. For both of us. Can you be good? Can you be absolutely silent?" "Yes, Mom," Oliver breathed, the words barely disturbing the air. Lara released him and watched as he crept to the designated corner, settling onto the floor with his back against the wall, making himself as small as possible. She took one last look at Edwin's sleeping form, at the envelope, perched temptingly at the table's edge, and turned toward the far end of the library where cleaning supplies waited. As she moved away, the door clicked shut with finality. The room fell into deeper silence, broken only by the storm raging beyond the windows and the persistent crackling of the fire, consuming wood, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Oliver sat perfectly still in his corner, his back pressed against the wall. His breath came in shallow measures, each inhale calculated to make no sound. The firelight danced across the walls, casting shadows, and he watched them with focused intensity. His legs cramped from sitting cross-legged, but he didn't dare move. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't wake him." Time passed slowly, marked by the crackling fire. Oliver's eyes drifted across the room, and then he saw it. The envelope with donations written in elegant script. It had been positioned at the edge of the table, and now it was moving, sliding toward the edge, millimeter by millimeter. Oliver's breath caught. He stood hesitantly, his knees cracking softly. He froze, waiting for Edwin to stir. But the old man remained still. Oliver took careful steps forward, his feet finding purchase with delicate precision. The envelope teetered at the edge. He reached out and gently pushed it back toward the center. The paper felt expensive, heavy. He could feel the bills inside. But he didn't open it. That would be stealing. Something else caught his eye. Edwin's eyeglasses had fallen to the floor beside the chair. Oliver knelt down and retrieved them carefully, then placed them on the table beside the envelope, folding the temples inward. But as he straightened, he noticed something. Edwin was shivering, just the faintest tremor running through his shoulders. The fire was dying down, and the storm outside rattled the windows. The old man's hands were pulled inward, fingers curling as though seeking warmth. Oliver looked down at his own thin jacket. It was his only coat. But the old man was shivering. Oliver had been cold before. He knew what it felt like. His hands moved before his mind could process the decision, shrugging out of the jacket. He approached the armchair and draped it over Edwin's legs, tucking it gently around his knees. The jacket looked ridiculously small, but it was all he had to offer. Behind his closed eyelids, Edwin had been awake the entire time, watching through narrow slits. He had arranged this test precisely, placing the envelope, positioning the glasses, letting the fire burn low. He had expected the boy to take the money. Everyone took the money eventually. But the child had pushed the envelope back, saved the glasses, and now was covering him with his own coat. Edwin felt something crack inside his chest. The boy's kindness was so unexpected that his breathing hitched, skipping a beat. His eyelids cracked open, and he found himself staring at the child's solemn face, at eyes filled with concern. In that instant, somewhere deep in the house, a sound erupted like thunder. Glass shattering, the crash echoing through the corridors. Oliver jumped violently, his entire body jerking with surprise, his hand flying to his chest. The sound had come from far away, perhaps the kitchen, but it might as well have been a gunshot for the way it shattered the library's silence. The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, and Lara rushed in, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with panic. She saw Oliver standing beside the armchair, saw Edwin's eyes now fully open and alert, saw the jacket draped across the old man's legs, and her mind immediately leaped to the worst conclusion. "Oliver!" she gasped, the name torn from her throat. "What did you do? What have you done?" Her voice rose with each word, trembling with barely controlled hysteria. "I told you not to move. I told you to stay in your corner. I told you not to touch anything, not to disturb him, not to—" "Mom, I didn't mean to," Oliver began, his voice small and frightened. "Not to wake him up," she continued, her hands shaking as she reached for her son, pulling him away from the armchair. "Do you understand what this means? Do you understand what you've done to us? I specifically told you to sit still. I told you not to move. Why didn't you listen?" "He was cold," Oliver whispered, tears beginning to well in his eyes. "I was just trying to help. He was shivering, and the envelope was falling, and his glasses were on the floor, and I thought—" "You weren't supposed to think," Lara said, her voice cracking. "You were supposed to sit. That's all. Just sit." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Mallory," Lara interrupted, turning her desperate gaze to Edwin. "I'm so incredibly sorry. He's just a child. He doesn't understand. Please, I'll pay for any damage. I'll work extra hours. I'll do anything. Just please don't call the agency. Please don't report us. We need this job. We need it so badly. I have rent due, and the electric company is threatening to shut off our power. And I can't lose another job. Not again, please." The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, her professional composure completely shattered, replaced by the raw terror of a mother watching her fragile world collapse around her once again. Oliver stood trembling beside her, his thin shoulders shaking without his jacket, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall completely. Lara's eyes darted frantically between her son and the old man, trying to piece together what had happened. Oliver stood trembling beside Edwin's armchair, his thin shoulders shaking without his jacket, his arms wrapped around his torso. The firelight cast harsh shadows across his pale face. Edwin remained in his chair, the boy's worn jacket draped across his legs, its faded fabric and duct-taped tears painfully obvious against the rich leather. To Lara's panicked mind, the scene could only mean one thing. Her son had disturbed the sleeping man, violated every rule, destroyed their one chance at survival. Edwin rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, letting Oliver's jacket slide to the floor. His movements were controlled and theatrical, each gesture calculated. He was a tall man, despite his age, and when he drew himself up, he towered over both mother and child with imposing presence. His white hair caught the firelight as he turned. His finger shot out suddenly, pointing downward, and both Lara and Oliver flinched. "Look at this," Edwin said, his voice cold and sharp as winter ice. "Look what has been done to my rug." Lara's gaze followed his pointing finger to the Persian rug beneath his chair, and her stomach dropped with sickening velocity. There, spread across the intricate pattern of reds and golds, was a dark stain roughly the size of a dinner plate. The water had soaked into the ancient fibers, creating a bloom of discoloration that stood out starkly against the surrounding design. Her mind raced backward, trying desperately to remember if she had spilled something, knocked over a glass, tracked in snow from her wet boots when they first arrived. But she had been nowhere near that chair, which meant Oliver must have done it somehow. "This rug," Edwin continued, his voice rising, "is a 19th century hand-woven import from Persia. It was purchased by my grandfather during his travels through Isfahan. It has been in my family for over 100 years. Do you understand what that means? Do you comprehend the value of what has been destroyed?" "I'm so sorry," Lara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how it happened. I'll fix it. I'll pay for it." "Pay for it?" Edwin's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Do you have any idea what this rug is worth? The replacement value alone would be $30,000. $30,000! Can you even conceive of such a sum?" The number hit Lara like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs in a single shocked gasp. $30,000. It was more money than she would earn in 2 years of working every cleaning job she could find. It was an impossible amount, a figure so large it existed in a realm, completely separate from her daily reality of counting pennies for bus fare and rationing meals to stretch through the week. Her knees threatened to buckle beneath her, and she reached out instinctively, her hand finding Oliver's shoulder and gripping it hard enough to make him wince, using him as an anchor to keep herself upright. "I don't have that kind of money," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't have anything close to that. But I'll work. I'll work every shift you need. Every day, every night, weekends, holidays. I'll work without pay until the debt is covered. However long it takes. Years, if necessary. Just please don't call the police. Don't report this to the agency. I'm begging you." Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and unchecked, blurring her vision until Edwin became nothing more than a tall shape, backlit by the fire. She was not a woman who cried easily, but the weight of this disaster was too much to bear. Oliver stood frozen beside his mother, his eyes wide with confusion and growing horror. He didn't understand what he had done wrong. He had been trying to help. The envelope was falling, the glasses were on the floor, the old man was cold. But somehow that kindness had created this nightmare. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. Edwin let the silence stretch, watching the mother and child with an unreadable expression. The fire popped and hissed behind him. The storm continued its assault on the windows. And then, without warning, he turned his attention fully to Oliver, his piercing gaze, fixing on the boy with such intensity that Oliver felt pinned in place like a butterfly under glass. "You," Edwin said quietly, his voice cutting through the room despite its low volume. "Do you think this is your fault?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with implications that Oliver couldn't begin to unpack. Lara's hand tightened on his shoulder, her fingernails digging into his skin through his thin shirt. She didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move, didn't dare do anything that might influence his answer or draw Edwin's wrath back toward herself. The boy looked up at the old man, his dark eyes glistening with unshed tears, his lower lip trembling with the effort of holding back sobs. The fire crackled. The clock ticked, and everyone waited, frozen in this moment of terrible judgment, to hear what the child would say. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Cliffside House, cold and gray as steel. Lara arrived at the servants' entrance just after dawn, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from a sleepless night. Oliver walked beside her, his small hand clutching hers with desperate strength, his fingers cold despite the thin gloves she had found at a second-hand store. Neither had spoken during the bus ride through the empty pre-dawn streets, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. The previous night's accusation hung over them like a sword suspended by fraying thread. But Edwin had other plans, plans that had taken shape during his own sleepless night, as he sat alone in the darkness of his bedroom. The test with the envelope and the rug had revealed something genuine in the boy, something that had cracked the calcified walls around Edwin's heart in ways he hadn't thought possible. But one act of decency could be anomaly, accident, performance calculated to win sympathy. Edwin's decades of disappointment with his own children had taught him to be thorough, to test again and again before allowing himself the dangerous luxury of hope. And so, in the pre-dawn darkness, he had taken his antique pocket watch from the bedside table where it had rested for decades, the same watch Oliver had held so carefully the night before, and locked it inside a drawer in his study with deliberate purpose. He placed the key in his vest pocket, feeling its weight against his chest like a secret burden, then summoned the housekeeper. The housekeeper arrived within minutes, her thin face pinched with the perpetual disapproval that seemed etched into every line and crease. Edwin stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his expression grave and troubled, as though wrestling with some painful realization. "My pocket watch is missing," he announced, his voice carrying confusion and accusation. "The antique watch I showed to guests last week. It was on my bedside table when I retired, and this morning it's gone. Alert the staff. Tell them to watch the cleaning woman closely. If she tries to leave before we've resolved this, they're to stop her." The housekeeper departed with unseemly haste, carrying the news through the mansion. Within the hour, every member of the household staff regarded Lara with suspicion, their eyes following her movements, their conversations stopping whenever she entered a room, resuming in urgent whispers the moment she passed. She felt the weight of their judgment like physical pressure against her chest. Oliver stayed close to her side, sensing the shift in atmosphere, knowing instinctively that something had gone terribly wrong. By midday, a black car pulled up to the front entrance. Daniel Mallory emerged with aggressive confidence, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than Lara's yearly rent. He was 42 years old, his face carefully maintained, his eyes cold and calculating. He swept into the library where Edwin waited. Two security guards followed in his wake, large men with closed expressions who positioned themselves near the doorway with casual readiness. "Father," Daniel said, embracing Edwin with perfunctory affection. "I came as soon as I heard." "A theft? In your own home? This is unacceptable. We should search her belongings immediately. If she's stolen from you once, who knows what else she's taken? We need to act before she disposes of the evidence." Edwin raised his hand, a gesture that quieted his son. "She's in the East Wing. The housekeeper will fetch her." Minutes later, Lara stood in the library doorway with Oliver pressed against her side, his small hands gripping her coat with white-knuckled intensity. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with terrible understanding. The security guards shifted, blocking any escape route, their bulk filling the doorframe. Daniel regarded her with undisguised contempt. "Your bag," Daniel said. "Empty it. Now." "I haven't stolen anything," Lara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I would never." "Then you'll have no objection to proving your innocence," Daniel interrupted. "The bag. Now." Edwin watched from his position by the fireplace, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed not on Lara, but on Oliver. On the way, the boy clung to his mother, with desperate protectiveness, on the instinct that made him position his small body between her and the men who threatened her despite his obvious fear. "There's one more thing," Edwin said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. "If the watch is not found by sundown, Miss Mendez will be dismissed permanently. I'll report this theft to the authorities, and the agency will blacklist her from future employment." The words landed like physical blows, each one precisely calibrated to strike at Lara's most vulnerable points. Oliver felt his mother's body sag slightly, felt the tremor that ran through her entire frame, and held on tighter, knowing he was witnessing something terrible, something that would change everything, but utterly powerless to stop it from unfolding before his eyes. Evening descended upon Cliffside House like a shroud. The fog rolled in from the ocean, thick and gray, pressing against the windows, obscuring the cliffs beyond. Edwin stood at the window, watching the fog consume the landscape before turning to the housekeeper. "Send for Miss Mendez and the boy," he said quietly. "Bring them here, now." She departed without question, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Edwin moved to his desk and retrieved a small brass key from his vest pocket. The safe was hidden behind a portrait of his grandfather, and it opened with a mechanical click. Inside, wrapped in velvet cloth, sat the pocket watch. Beside it, carefully folded, was a section of the Persian rug that showed no water damage whatsoever, its colors vibrant and unmarred. Minutes later, Lara appeared in the doorway with Oliver clutching her hand, both looking like condemned prisoners. Her eyes were hollow with exhaustion and fear, her shoulders bowed. Oliver's face was pale, his gaze darting between his mother and the old man. The security guards had been dismissed. Daniel had been sent away. It was just the three of them now, surrounded by walls of books and encroaching darkness. "Come in," Edwin said, gesturing toward the chairs before his desk. "Close the door behind you." Lara obeyed mechanically, her movements those of someone who had given up hope. She and Oliver sat, their bodies rigid with tension, waiting for judgment. The fire crackled behind them, casting dancing shadows. Edwin remained standing, his tall frame backlit by the flames. He walked to the desk with measured steps and opened the safe fully, reaching inside to withdraw the pocket watch first. The silver case gleamed as he set it on the polished surface with a soft thud that made both Lara and Oliver flinch. Then he withdrew the rug section, unfolding it carefully and placing it beside the watch so that its perfect, unmarred surface was plainly visible. "The watch was never missing," Edwin said calmly. "I locked it in this safe before dawn, and the rug was never damaged. What you saw was a separate piece I had deliberately soaked with water." The words hung in the air, each syllable dropping like stones into still water. Lara's face transformed, confusion giving way to shock, then to dawning comprehension, and finally to something that looked like rage barely contained. "I orchestrated everything," Edwin continued, his gaze fixed on Oliver. The envelope positioned to fall, the eyeglasses on the floor, the dying fire. All of it was a test to see if genuine kindness still existed in this world. "A test?" Lara's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the force of a scream. She rose from her chair slowly, her legs trembling, her hands clenched into fists. "You put us through hell as a test? You made me believe I would lose everything, that my son had destroyed our lives, all so you could satisfy some curiosity about human nature? Miss Mendez," Edwin began, but she cut him off with a gesture so violent it seemed she might strike him. "You humiliated us," she said, her voice breaking as tears began to stream down her face. "You made me beg. You watched me cry and plead and offer to work without pay for years to cover a debt that never existed. You had your son threaten me with police and ruin while you stood there watching. How dare you treat us like laboratory animals for your amusement?" The accusations poured out of her in a torrent, all the fear and shame and desperation transforming into fury. Oliver remained in his chair, watching his mother with wide eyes, torn between fear of her anger and understanding of its justice. Edwin stood motionless, receiving her words like physical blows, his face gradually draining of color as the full weight of what he had done settled upon him with crushing force. "I didn't mean," he started, reaching out one hand as though to steady himself, but the gesture became something more. His knees buckled slightly, just enough to make him sway, and his face contorted with what might have been pain or might have been the sudden realization of his own cruelty. Oliver moved without thinking, his small body launching from the chair. His hand shot out and grabbed Edwin's arm, steadying the old man before he could fall. His grip surprisingly strong for someone so young. The contact was electric, breaking through the tension that had filled the room. Edwin looked down at the boy who was supporting him, at the concern written across Oliver's face despite everything, and something inside the old man's chest cracked open completely. "You still care," Edwin whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Even now, after everything I've done, you still reach out to help me." Oliver didn't speak, but he didn't let go either, his dark eyes meeting Edwin's with a steady gaze that held both forgiveness and reproach. Lara had frozen mid-tirade, watching this tableau with an expression caught between rage and confusion. The fog pressed harder against the windows. The fire continued its eternal consumption. And in that moment, suspended between anger and understanding, everything hung in fragile balance. Time moved differently after that night in the library. Lara no longer arrived at the servants' entrance with hunched shoulders. She walked through the front door with keys Edwin had given her, keys that opened every lock. The housekeeper who had once looked at her with contempt now reported to her as Lara transformed from cleaning woman to household manager, overseeing staff and maintaining the estate with efficiency born from years of making do with nothing. Oliver grew taller with each passing season, his thin frame filling out as regular meals replaced the uncertainty of their basement apartment days. After school, he would climb the grand staircase to the library where Edwin waited, working through homework that gradually shifted from elementary arithmetic to high school calculus. Edwin never raised his voice when Oliver struggled, never showed impatience. Instead, he would lean forward, his weathered hands gesturing as he broke down complex problems into manageable pieces, teaching patience as much as mathematics. On weekends, Edwin led Oliver to the sprawling garages behind the mansion, where 6 vintage buses sat in careful preservation, relics from the early days of Edwin's transportation company. The buses were massive things, their rounded bodies painted in fading reds and creams, their chrome fixtures dulled by decades. Edwin moved among them with reverence, running his hands along their sides. "Listen to the engine," Edwin would say, his hand on Oliver's shoulder as they stood before an idling bus. "Every engine has its own voice. When something's wrong, it tells you. You just have to learn the language." He taught Oliver how to check fluid levels, how to identify worn belts, how to listen to an engine's rhythm and hear what it was trying to communicate. They would work together in the dim garage light, the smell of oil and old metal surrounding them, Edwin's voice calm and instructional, as Oliver's hands learned to navigate carburetors and transmissions. These were not just vehicles to Edwin. They were monuments to his past, and in teaching Oliver to maintain them, he was passing down something more valuable than money. Winter came harsh to Seaford Bay that year, bringing storms that left the town's elderly population struggling. Lara stood in Edwin's study one December morning, presenting the idea that had been forming for weeks. "The dining room sits empty most days," she said, watching his face carefully. "What if we opened it once a week to seniors who need a warm meal and company?" Edwin's response was immediate. "Yes, absolutely yes. When can we start?" They spent the following weeks transforming the dining room into a gathering space, Lara coordinating with local churches, while Edwin funded everything from groceries to transportation. On the first Sunday, 23 elderly men and women arrived uncertain and wary, but they left with full stomachs and invitations to return. By the third week, the number had doubled. Edwin moved among his guests with an ease Lara had never seen in him, listening to their stories, remembering their names, treating each person as though their presence was a gift rather than charity received. Clara Ung visited on a gray afternoon in early spring, arriving with papers requiring Edwin's signature. She found him in the garage with Oliver, both covered in grease as they worked on a carburetor. After the business was concluded and Oliver had gone inside, Edwin walked Clara to her car, his steps slower than they had been even 6 months earlier. "I made a terrible mistake with my own children," Edwin said quietly, his gaze fixed on the ocean visible beyond the grounds. "I gave them everything except the opportunity to struggle, to learn kindness through necessity. They grew up entitled and empty." He paused, his hand gripping the car door handle for support. "But Oliver, that boy had nothing and still offered me his coat when I was cold. He saved a falling envelope that might have contained money, but he didn't take it. He helped me without asking for anything in return." Edwin's voice caught. "I wish I had raised children like him instead of the ones who bear my name. I wish I could undo those years and start again with the knowledge I have now. I wish I had more time to make it right." Clara placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tremor that had begun to plague him. "You're giving him what you can now. That matters more than you know." "It's not enough time," Edwin replied, but he smiled despite the words. "It never is." The morning arrived without warning, masquerading as an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn. Lara found Edwin in his library, settled into his favorite leather armchair with a book open in his lap, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The fire had burned down to embers during the night. His hand rested on the armrest in the same position he had maintained during that first test so many years ago. But this time, there was no deception. He had simply drifted from sleep into whatever lay beyond, his face peaceful, the ghost of a smile still visible. On the table beside him sat the restored pocket watch Oliver had maintained for him, its case polished to gleaming silver, its hands frozen at 3:17 in the morning. Lara stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hand pressed against her chest, and then she turned to find Oliver, to tell him that the man who had tested them and then loved them had finally found peace. The drawing room of Cliffside House felt smaller than Oliver remembered, its walls closing in as bodies filled every space. The same room where he had first stood trembling beside his mother now hosted an assembly dressed in expensive black, their grief performed rather than felt. Daniel Mallory stood near the fireplace with his siblings Victoria and Marcus flanking him, their collective presence radiating entitled confidence. Lara sat near the window with Oliver beside her, both dressed in their Sunday best, which still looked shabby compared to the designer morning wear surrounding them. The Mallory siblings' glances toward the corner carried undisguised contempt. Clara Ung stood at Edwin's mahogany desk, with the same red-ribboned folder she had carried 10 years ago, though this one was thicker, heavier. She opened it with practiced precision, withdrawing legal documents flagged with colored tabs. The room fell silent as she cleared her throat, every eye fixed upon her. Edwin Mallory's estate plan was meticulously rewritten over the last decade. The original will no longer applies. She paused, letting the words settle. Daniel's shoulders pulled back as though bracing for impact. Victoria's hand tightened on her pearl necklace. Marcus leaned forward, his expression darkening. Over the past 10 years, Edwin made 17 amendments. The final version represents his true wishes. The estate's primary assets have been left to Oliver Mendez. The words detonated in the silent room like a bomb whose explosion happened in slow motion. Daniel's face flushed crimson, blood rushing to his cheeks as his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. Victoria gasped, the sound sharp and theatrical, her free hand flying to her chest as though she had been physically struck. Marcus simply stared, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything he had assumed about his place in his father's affections. "That's impossible. This is fraud," Daniel managed, his voice rising. Clara remained level. "The will is legally sound. Your father's mental capacity was evaluated by 3 physicians. We're his children," Victoria said shrilly. "We have rights." Clara withdrew another document, this one written on personal stationery in Edwin's distinctive script. She held it up so everyone could see the signature. Your father left a personal letter. She began reading. 10 years ago, an 8-year-old boy taught me what it means to be human. I had tested him, set traps designed to reveal selfishness. But Oliver Mendes, who had nothing, chose to help me anyway. He saved a falling envelope and never took it. He returned my glasses. And when he saw that I was cold, he gave me his only coat. That moment saved my humanity. Oliver sat perfectly still in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, his dark eyes glistening with unshed tears as he listened to Edwin's words read aloud for the first time. In his right hand, he held the pocket watch Edwin had given him 2 years ago. After they had finished restoring it together in the garage, its silver case polished to a mirror shine, its chain replaced with new silver that gleamed in the afternoon light, filtering through the tall windows. His thumb traced the engraved initials on the case with the same gesture he had made as a child, seeking comfort in the familiar. Weight and texture of the object that had become a symbol of everything that had changed that night in the library so many years ago. Daniel took a step forward, his face contorted with rage that had finally broken through the veneer of civilized restraint. We're going to challenge this. We'll tie this up in courts for years. Clara set down the letter with careful deliberation, her expression hardening. The will has already been challenged and upheld. You filed preliminary objections 3 weeks ago, citing undue influence and mental incapacity. The court reviewed all documentation, including medical evaluations, witness testimony, and evidence of your father's deliberate planning over a full decade. Your challenge was denied with prejudice, meaning you cannot refile on the same grounds. The will stands as written. The words struck like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. Victoria's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank into the nearest chair, her carefully constructed composure crumbling into something approaching genuine shock. Marcus turned away toward the window, his shoulders sagging under the weight of defeat, and the realization that no amount of legal maneuvering would restore what they had lost through their own years of neglect and entitlement. Daniel stood frozen in place, his mouth working soundlessly, as he searched for arguments that would not come, strategies that had already failed, appeals that had already been rejected. Oliver looked down at the watch in his hand, its steady ticking a reminder that time moved forward, regardless of anyone's wishes, carrying away the old order and establishing new patterns that would reshape everything Edwin had built. The boy who had once taped his mother's shoes together with strips of duct tape now held the keys to an empire, not because he had sought wealth or power, but because he had offered his threadbare coat to a cold old man who desperately needed to believe in kindness one more time before he died. The library doors at Cliffside House stood open for the first time in the mansion's history, no longer guarded by stern housekeepers or restricted to those deemed worthy by birth. Oliver moved through the transformed space with purposeful strides, surveying the changes that had taken months to implement. The walls of books remained, their leather spines gleaming, but the furniture had been rearranged to create study areas where young people could gather without feeling the oppressive weight of formality. New desks lined the windows overlooking the ocean, waiting to be filled with homework and dreams. Computer stations occupied one corner, their screens glowing with promise, funded by the same fortune that had once served only to isolate Edwin from the world. A group of teenagers from Seaford Bay High School sat at the central table where Edwin had once tested Oliver, their voices rising and falling in animated discussion about calculus problems. Oliver paused near them, his hand resting on the back of a chair, listening to their easy banter and occasional frustrated sighs. One girl looked up at him, her expression hesitant, and he nodded encouragement before moving on, letting them find their own answers. This space was theirs now, transformed from a monument to the past into a workshop for the future. In the mansion's former ballroom, Lara stood before a desk covered with grant applications, transportation schedules, and correspondence from senior centers across the county. The Mallory Foundation had taken shape over the past 6 months, its mission statement hanging framed on the wall behind her in Edwin's distinctive handwriting. She wore reading glasses now, perched on her nose as she reviewed a proposal to expand their transportation services. The woman who had once cleaned these floors now commanded them, overseeing a staff of 7 and managing a budget that would have seemed impossible in those desperate days. When she had begged Edwin not to report her for damages that never existed, a young coordinator knocked on the doorframe, waiting for acknowledgement. Before entering with a clipboard full of appointment requests from seniors needing rides to medical appointments, grocery stores, and the simple human connections that poverty and age had made unreachable. Lara looked up, pushing her glasses higher, and gestured him in with efficient warmth. Together they discussed routes and schedules, optimizing the fleet of refurbished buses that Oliver had restored using the skills Edwin had taught him. The buses bore the Mallory name on their sides, but they carried a different legacy now, one built on service rather than profit. The afternoon waned as Oliver left the mansion, walking toward the cliff's edge, where the ground dropped away into nothing and the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The wind caught his jacket, pulling at the fabric, carrying the salt smell of the sea and the cries of gulls wheeling overhead. He stood at the precipice where Edwin had once stood, contemplating his own disappointments. But Oliver's gaze held something different. In his right hand, he held the pocket watch that had started everything, its silver case catching the dying light. He opened the case with his thumb, the mechanism clicking softly, revealing the face whose hands moved with steady purpose. The watch ticked against his palm, a reminder of Edwin's heartbeat that had finally stilled, but whose rhythm continued in every student who studied in the library, every senior who rode to an appointment they might otherwise have missed. Oliver closed the case and held it against his chest, his eyes drifting closed as the ocean wind washed over him and the waves crashed against the cliffs below. "You gave me a chance," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind and water. "Now I'll give others the same." The words carried away on the wind, dissolving into the vast space between sea and sky. Oliver stood for a long moment more, his head bowed, the watch pressed against his heart, before finally turning back toward the mansion that rose behind him. The sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that transformed the austere stone structure into something welcoming. Lights began to glow in the windows, warm yellow rectangles against the gathering dusk. The camera angle shifted, pulling back and rising as though lifted by the wind. The house grew smaller, but no less significant as the perspective widened, revealing the full scope of the estate that had once been a fortress of suspicion and had become a beacon of possibility. The cliffs stretched away on either side, their rugged beauty unchanged by human drama. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, waves building and breaking in patterns that predated Edwin's tests and would outlast Oliver's promises. But in that moment, as dusk settled over, Seaford Bay and the lights of Cliffside House burned steady against the encroaching darkness. The transformation felt complete. The boy who had saved a falling envelope and given his coat to a cold stranger had become the man who opened doors that had been closed, who extended chances to others as a chance had once been extended to him. Some stories remind us how powerful a single act of kindness can be. If Oliver's journey touched your heart, share your thoughts below. Your words may comfort someone else watching tonight. If someone in your life could use a reminder that hope still exists, feel free to pass this story along. And if you'd like to hear more true stories like this, we'd be grateful to have you join our community. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.